On my 70th birthday, my daughter-in-law raised a champagne glass and smiled. To the old lady headed for a nursing home. The room erupted in laughter. I just smiled and took a sip of my tea. 2 weeks later, a lawyer would reveal something that changed everything. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end of my story, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this story reaches. For most of my life, I believe birthdays were about family. Not gifts. Not cake. Not expensive dinners. Just family. The people you loved gathered around one table. The people you sacrificed for. The people who knew your stories. The people who remembered who you were before your hair turned gray. My 70th birthday was supposed to be one of those days. At least that's what I thought. The morning began quietly. Soft sunlight filtered through the kitchen curtains. The old grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily. The house smelled faintly of vanilla and cinnamon from the cake cooling on the counter. I stood by the window holding a mug of coffee and watched a pair of robins hopping across the backyard. For a moment, everything felt peaceful. At 70, I've learned to appreciate small things. A warm cup of coffee. A sunny morning. A phone call from a grandchild. The sound of laughter drifting through the house. Especially after losing my husband. Harold had been gone for 3 years. Some mornings I still reached across the bed expecting to find him there. His side remained untouched. His reading glasses still sat in the top drawer of his nightstand. I couldn't bring myself to move them. Certain absences never become normal. You simply learn how to carry them. Harold loved birthdays. Every year he insisted on decorating the dining room himself. Poorly. Very poorly. The streamers were always crooked. The balloons never stayed where he wanted them. But he treated every birthday like a national holiday. Especially mine. I smiled at the memory as I arranged fresh flowers in the center of the dining table. White roses. My favorite. The same flowers Harold brought me on our first anniversary. The dining room looked beautiful. Simple. Warm. Comfortable. Exactly the way I liked it. There would be 12 people attending. My son Daniel. His wife Melissa. Their 2 children. My niece Rebecca and her husband. Several close family friends. Nothing extravagant. Just the people I cared about most. At least that was the plan. By noon, the house was buzzing with activity. Guests began arriving. Cars filled the driveway. Laughter drifted through the rooms. For a while I felt genuinely happy. Daniel hugged me when he arrived. His embrace felt brief. Distracted. But I ignored the feeling. People grow busy. Children become adults. Life changes. That's what I kept telling myself. Melissa arrived a few steps behind him. Perfect makeup. Perfect smile. Perfect hair. Everything about her always looked carefully arranged. Even her kindness. She carried a bottle of expensive champagne. "Happy birthday, Margaret," she said. Her smile never quite reached her eyes. "Thank you, Melissa." I hugged her anyway. I've always tried to see the best in people. Sometimes longer than I should. The afternoon passed pleasantly. Children ran through the backyard. Guests chatted on the patio. Music played softly from the living room speakers. The house felt alive again. For the first time in months, I felt something close to contentment. Maybe even gratitude. Perhaps I have been worrying too much lately. Perhaps the growing distance I sensed between Daniel and me existed only in my imagination. Perhaps everything was fine. Then dinner began. And everything changed. We gathered around the large oak dining table Harold built with his own hands nearly 40 years earlier. I sat at the head of the table. Daniel sat across from me. Melissa sat beside him. Candles flickered. Glasses clinked. Conversations flowed. Someone joked about turning 70. Another guest teased me about finally slowing down. I laughed. The mood felt light. Comfortable. Then Melissa stood. First, I assumed she wanted to make a birthday toast. Nothing unusual. People often do that at milestone birthdays. She lifted her champagne glass. Everyone turned toward her. The room gradually quieted. A smile spread across her face. Not a warm smile. Not a loving smile. Something else. Something sharper. Something colder. "Before we eat," she said, "I'd like to make a special toast." People smiled. A few raised their glasses. I smiled too. Then she looked directly at me. To the old lady headed for a nursing home. For a second nobody moved. The words seemed to hang in the air. Floating. Waiting. Then someone laughed. Another person joined in. A few nervous chuckles followed. Soon half the table was laughing. Not everyone. But enough. Enough to make my stomach tighten. Enough to make my hands go cold. I looked toward Daniel. My son. The little boy who once cried when I left him at kindergarten. The young man I worked double shifts to put through college. The man whose heart I believed I knew. He didn't laugh. But he didn't object either. He simply lowered his eyes. And said nothing. Somehow that hurt more. I felt dozens of eyes watching me. Waiting. Expecting a reaction. An argument. Tears. Embarrassment. Something. Instead I smiled. Slowly. Calmly. I lifted my teacup. Took a sip. And said nothing. Melissa looked almost disappointed. As though she had expected a scene. As though she had rehearsed for one. The conversation eventually resumed. But the room felt different now. The warmth had vanished. Something ugly had revealed itself. Something that had likely existed much longer than I realized. For the rest of the evening I watched. I listened. I paid attention. And once I started paying attention I noticed things. The exchanged glances. The whispered conversations. The sudden silences when I approached. The way Melissa occasionally smiled to herself. The way Daniel avoided looking directly at me. Small things. Tiny things. The kind of details most people overlook. But at 70 years old, you learn that small things often hide large truths. By the time the last guest left that night, I was exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. I stood alone in the dining room. The candles had burned low. Half-empty glasses remained scattered across the table. A few wilted rose petals rested on the tablecloth. The house felt strangely quiet. I thought about Melissa's toast. Not the words themselves. The certainty behind them. She hadn't spoken like someone making a joke. She had spoken like someone announcing a decision already made. That thought stayed with me. Long after midnight. Long after I climbed into bed. Long after sleep should have come. As I stared at the ceiling, one question repeated itself over and over. Why would my daughter-in-law be so certain I was headed for a nursing home? Unless she knew something I didn't. And before the sun rose the next morning, I had made a decision. I was going to find out exactly what was happening, no matter what it cost. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Melissa standing beside the birthday table with that champagne glass in her hand. To the old lady headed for a nursing home. The words replayed again and again. Not because they were cruel. I've lived long enough to hear cruel things. What bothered me was something else. Certainty. Melissa hadn't sounded like someone making a joke. She sounded like someone discussing plans that were already in motion. Around 4 a.m, I finally got out of bed. The house was silent. The kind of silence that feels heavier after losing someone. I wrapped a cardigan around my shoulders and walked downstairs. The kitchen looked exactly as Harold and I had left it thousands of times before. The old coffee maker. The oak cabinets. The ceramic cookie jar Harold bought during a vacation in Vermont nearly 20 years ago. Some things never change. People do. I made a cup of coffee and sat by the window. Outside, the first light of dawn was beginning to color the sky. For a long time I simply sat there thinking. 3 years. 3 years since Harold passed away. Some days it felt like yesterday. Other days it felt like an entire lifetime ago. When Harold was alive, everything seemed simpler. Not easier. Just steadier. He had a way of keeping the family together. Birthdays. Thanksgiving dinners. Christmas mornings. Harold made sure everyone showed up. And everyone did. After he died, things slowly changed. First I blamed grief. Everyone handles loss differently. Daniel threw himself into work. Melissa became busier with social events and charity committees. The grandchildren grew older. Life moved forward. Or at least that's what I told myself. The truth was harder to admit. I was becoming less important. Not overnight. Not dramatically. It happened little by little. A missed phone call. A canceled lunch. A holiday visit shortened from 4 hours to 40 minutes. Small things. Harmless things. At least individually. Together, they told a different story. I remembered the Mother's Day brunch 2 years earlier. Melissa had called the night before. She sounded apologetic. "We're exhausted, Margaret. The kids have soccer practice all weekend." I told her not to worry. The next day I saw photos online. The entire family had spent the afternoon at a country club with Melissa's parents. Everyone looked happy. Everyone looked rested. I wasn't there. I remembered my grandson Ethan's baseball championship. Daniel promised to save me a seat. When I arrived, every seat was occupied. Melissa smiled and said she thought I wasn't coming. I ended up standing near the fence for 2 hours. Nobody seemed to notice. At the time I brushed it off. Now those memories felt different. Sharper. More deliberate. Like puzzle pieces finally fitting together. The coffee had gone cold before I realized it. I poured it down the sink and started another pot. Retirement wasn't supposed to look like this. When Harold and I were younger, we used to talk about our future. Long drives. National parks. A small beach rental every summer. Spoiling grandchildren. Growing old together. Instead, I spent most mornings alone. Not because I hated being alone. There's a difference. Solitude can be peaceful. Being forgotten cannot. Financially, I was comfortable enough. Harold had planned carefully. The mortgage was paid off years ago. The bills were manageable. I wasn't wealthy, but I wasn't struggling. The house itself was worth a considerable amount now. Property values had risen dramatically over the years. Sometimes real estate agents left business cards in my mailbox, asking if I was interested in selling. I never was. This wasn't just a house. It was my life. Every room held memories. The hallway where Daniel took his first steps. The kitchen where Harold taught the grandchildren how to bake cookies. The living room where we celebrated 46 anniversaries together. You can't put a price on things like that. Around 8 o'clock my phone buzzed. A text message from Daniel. "Morning, Mom. Hope you had a nice birthday." That was it. One sentence. No mention of Melissa's toast. No apology. No explanation. Nothing. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I typed a simple reply. "Thank you, sweetheart." I almost asked him about the nursing home comment. Almost. But something stopped me. Instinct, perhaps. If something was happening behind my back, asking questions too early would only make people more careful. No. I needed answers first. Questions could come later. I spent the rest of the morning cleaning up after the party. Washing dishes. Folding tablecloths. Putting away decorations. Ordinary tasks. The kind that give your hands something to do while your mind works. As I carried a box of decorations into the garage, I noticed something strange. A stack of folders sitting on a workbench near the side wall. I hadn't put them there. Harold's old workbench was rarely used anymore. Curious? You walked over. Most of the folders contained household paperwork. Insurance documents. Property tax records. Maintenance receipts. Nothing unusual. Then I noticed one folder was missing. A blue folder. The one that contained copies of important property documents. I knew exactly which folder it was, because Harold had organized everything before he passed away. He labeled every file, every account, every document. The blue folder was gone. I stood there for several seconds. Maybe I had moved it. Maybe I was forgetting. At 70, that possibility crossed my mind. But deep down I knew better. I remembered seeing that folder just a few months earlier. Very clearly. My pulse quickened. For the first time since Melissa's toast, I felt something stronger than confusion. Suspicion. Real suspicion. I slowly closed the filing cabinet. Something wasn't right. Something had been happening for longer than I realized. And for the first time I began to wonder whether that birthday toast had been more than humiliation. Maybe it had been a warning. Or worse, a glimpse into a plan I wasn't supposed to discover. And if that was true, I needed to find out exactly who was involved, before they made their next move. For the next few days I said nothing, called no one. I asked no questions. I simply watched. At my age, people often assume you're no longer paying attention. That can be a useful thing. When people believe you've stopped noticing, they become careless. 3 days after my birthday, Daniel called. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. "Mom, we're having dinner at our place on Friday. You should come." The invitation surprised me. Family dinners had become rare lately. Usually there was an excuse. Busy schedules. School activities. Work commitments. This time there was no hesitation. No delay. No excuse. Just an invitation. Of course I accepted. Friday evening arrived with steady spring rain tapping softly against my windshield as I drove across town. Daniel and Melissa lived in a large suburban neighborhood about 30 minutes from my house. A beautiful place. Wide streets. Perfect lawns. Expensive homes. The kind of neighborhood Harold used to jokingly call, too perfect to be real. When I arrived, Melissa greeted me at the door. Her smile looked flawless. Almost rehearsed. "Margaret, you made it." She kissed my cheek. For a brief moment, I wondered if I had imagined everything. The birthday toast. The missing folder. The growing distance. Maybe grief had made me overly suspicious. Maybe I was searching for problems where none existed. Then I stepped inside. And that feeling disappeared. The atmosphere felt strange. Not hostile. Just unnatural. Daniel seemed distracted. Melissa seemed overly cheerful. Even the children behaved differently. Ethan hugged me quickly before running upstairs. My granddaughter Lily barely looked up from her tablet. Everyone seemed eager to avoid being alone with me, as though they had silently agreed on something beforehand. Dinner was roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. One of Daniel's favorites. We sat around their dining table making polite conversation. School. Sports. The weather. Nothing important. Nothing real. Several times I caught Daniel and Melissa exchanging glances. Small glances. Quick glances. The kind people think nobody notices. I noticed. Every single one. About halfway through dinner, Melissa brought up real estate. The topic appeared out of nowhere. "I saw a house sell near your neighborhood last week," she said casually. I looked up from my plate. "Oh, it sold in less than 3 days." Daniel immediately focused on his food. Melissa continued. "The market is still incredibly strong." I nodded. "I suppose so. You'd probably get an amazing price for your house." There it was. The first direct mention. Small. Harmless. Almost innocent. But deliberate. I felt it immediately. "My house isn't for sale." I smiled as I said it. Melissa smiled too. "Of course not. I was just saying." Then she changed the subject. Too quickly. Far too quickly. The conversation moved on. But the feeling remained. An hour later, while helping clear dishes, I walked into the kitchen unexpectedly. Melissa was standing near the counter speaking quietly to Daniel. They didn't hear me enter. "Not much longer," she whispered. Daniel looked uncomfortable. "I know. We have to figure this out." Then they saw me. The conversation stopped instantly. Melissa smiled. "Can I get you some coffee?" As though nothing had happened. As though I hadn't heard a word. I smiled back. "That would be lovely." The rest of the evening passed quietly. Around 9 o'clock I prepared to leave. As I walked toward the front door, my granddaughter Lily suddenly appeared beside me. Children often notice things adults overlook. And sometimes they say things adults would never dare say. "Grandma." "Yes, sweetheart." She lowered her voice. "When are you moving?" I froze. Only for a second. But long enough. "Moving where?" She looked confused. "To your new place." A chill traveled down my spine. "What new place?" Now Lily looked even more confused. "The place Mom keeps talking about." Before she could continue, Melissa appeared. Almost instantly. Almost as if she'd been watching. "Lily, honey, go finish your homework." The girl disappeared upstairs. Melissa laughed softly. "You know kids. They hear pieces of conversations and make up stories." I smiled. Of course. But inside my pulse was racing. The drive home felt longer than usual. Rain streaked across the windshield. Streetlights blurred into gold reflections on wet pavement. I kept hearing Lily's voice. "When are you moving?" Children rarely invent ideas like that on their own. Especially not repeatedly. Someone had been talking. Someone had been talking enough for it to sound normal. Expected. Certain. Just like Melissa's birthday toast. The moment I walked through my front door, I knew one thing. The nursing home comment hadn't been a joke. Not even close. They were discussing my future. Without me. Making plans. Assumptions. Decisions. The question was why. I hung my coat near the front entrance and stood quietly in the dark living room. The familiar house seemed different somehow. More vulnerable. As though invisible hands were already reaching toward it. Toward everything Harold and I had built together. I turned on a lamp beside the sofa. Its warm light illuminated the framed family photographs lining the shelves. Birthdays. Graduations. Christmas mornings. Vacations. Decades of memories. A lifetime. And suddenly another thought entered my mind. One I had been avoiding. What if the missing folder wasn't an accident? What if someone had needed those documents? The idea refused to leave. At 10 o'clock that night, I sat at my desk and began making a list. The birthday toast. The missing property folder. The real estate conversation. The secret whispers. Lily's question. Individually, each could be explained away. Together they formed a pattern. And patterns tell stories. For the first time I stopped asking whether something was wrong. I already knew something was wrong. Now I needed to discover how far it went. And who had been helping Melissa behind my back. The next morning, I woke up with the same feeling sitting heavily in my chest. Not fear. Not exactly. Felt more like certainty. The kind that arrives before you have proof. I knew something was happening. I just didn't know how much. Or how long. Outside the sky was gray. Rain from the night before still clung to the maple trees lining my street. I made breakfast and tried. Reading the newspaper. The words blurred together. My mind kept returning to the blue folder. The missing property documents. Harold had always been meticulous. Every account. Every insurance policy. Every deed. Every tax document. Everything had its place. During the last year of his life, he spent countless hours organizing our records. I want everything simple for you if something happens to me, he used to say. At the time, I hated those conversations. I didn't want to imagine losing him. Now I was grateful he had been so careful. Because his habits made one thing very clear. That folder hadn't simply disappeared. Someone had taken it. By late morning, I drove to the county records office. I wasn't entirely sure what I was looking for. Only that I needed information. The building sat downtown between a bank and an insurance agency. Nothing remarkable. Just another government office. Inside, a young woman directed me toward the property records department. The clerk behind the counter looked no older than 30. She smiled politely. How can I help you today? I handed her my address. I'd like to review the most recent public records associated with my property. She typed for a moment. Then frowned slightly. Not dramatically. Just enough. What is it? I asked. Her expression immediately became professional again. Oh, nothing unusual. But she hesitated. And after 70 years of dealing with people, I had learned that hesitation often speaks louder than words. She turned her monitor slightly. These are the most recent filings connected to the property. Several documents appeared on the screen. Tax records. Utility easements. Routine paperwork. Then one entry caught my attention. A request for property valuation information. Submitted 6 months earlier. My stomach tightened. Who requested that? The clerk studied the record. It appears an authorized family representative requested a copy. Family representative. The phrase echoed in my mind. Which family representative? I'm sorry. I can't disclose personal information without a formal request. Of course she couldn't. I thanked her and left. But the damage was already done. Someone had been gathering information about my house. 6 months ago. Long before my birthday. Long before the nursing home toast. Long before Lily asked when I was moving. I sat in my car staring through the windshield. Everything was beginning to connect. Not completely. But enough. The nursing home comment wasn't spontaneous. The real estate conversation wasn't casual. The missing folder wasn't random. Someone had been planning something. And planning it for quite a while. The drive home felt strangely quiet. As though my mind had finally crossed a line. Until now, I had been looking for innocent explanations. Now I wasn't. Now I was looking for evidence. When I arrived home, I checked my mailbox. Mostly advertisements. A utility bill. several catalogs. Then I noticed a white envelope addressed to me. No return address. Inside was a brochure. A nursing home brochure. My hands froze. The cover showed smiling seniors sitting around a garden fountain. The words beneath the photo read, "Comfort, community, care." I stared at it for several seconds. Then I slowly opened it. Someone had circled several sections in blue ink. Private rooms, transportation services, memory support programs. At the bottom of one page, a handwritten note appeared. This could be perfect. No signature. No explanation. Nothing. Just those 4 words. I sat down at the kitchen table. The brochure spread open before me. For the first time since Harold died, I felt genuinely shaken. Not because of the nursing home itself. Many good people choose communities like that. There is nothing wrong with needing help. That wasn't the issue. The issue was simple. Nobody had discussed this with me. Nobody had asked me. Yet someone was clearly discussing it. Making plans. Researching options. Preparing. And somehow I was the last person to know. I thought about Daniel. The possibility hurt. I wanted to believe my son wasn't involved. I wanted to believe Melissa was acting alone. But every time I remembered his silence during the birthday toast, my confidence weakened. Silence can reveal a great deal. Especially from someone who should be defending you. That afternoon, I decided to call someone I hadn't spoken to in months. Harold's attorney, Richard Benson. He had handled our estate planning for nearly 20 years. Careful man. Trustworthy. Harold respected him. If anyone knew whether something unusual had happened regarding our property, it would be Richard. His assistant answered. After checking the schedule, she offered me an appointment for the following Tuesday. 5 days away. I accepted immediately. As I hung up the phone, I noticed something unusual through the front window. A dark SUV parked across the street. First I thought nothing of it. Then I recognized the driver. Melissa. She was sitting behind the wheel, watching my house. The moment our eyes met through the glass, she started the engine and drove away. Slowly, calmly, as though she had every right to be there. I stood frozen beside the window. A chill traveled through me. Because people don't sit outside someone else's house for no reason. Especially not after researching nursing homes. Especially not after property documents go missing. Especially not after making jokes about sending someone away. For the first time, I stopped wondering whether Melissa was involved. Now I knew she was. The only question left was how much Daniel knew. And whether my own son had already chosen a side. After seeing Melissa sitting outside my house, I stopped doubting myself. For weeks I had been questioning my instincts. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe grief was clouding my judgment. Maybe I was connecting things that had nothing to do with each other. Not anymore. The look on Melissa's face when she realized I had seen her told me everything. She wasn't there by accident. And whatever was happening had become urgent enough for her to start watching me. That realization changed something inside me. I became careful. Very careful. The following days I acted exactly the way everyone expected. I called Daniel once to ask about Ethan's baseball game. I sent Lily a birthday card for her friend. I thanked Melissa by text for hosting dinner. Nothing unusual. Nothing suspicious. If they were watching me, I wanted them to see the same harmless 70-year-old widow they thought they knew. Meanwhile, I paid attention. Started writing everything down. Dates. Conversations. Comments. Small details. The notebook stayed hidden inside Harold's old desk drawer. Every evening I added another page. The birthday toast. The missing folder. The nursing home brochure. The property records request. Melissa sitting outside my house. Seeing the events written together made them look even worse. Not random. Not isolated. Connected. 5 days later, Tuesday finally arrived. I drove to Richard Benson's law office 20 minutes early. The building was located in a quiet business district downtown. Richard had practiced there for nearly 30 years. Harold trusted him completely. So did I. The receptionist recognized me immediately. Mrs. Turner. It's good to see you. I smiled politely, though my stomach felt tight. 10 minutes later, Richard entered the waiting room. He looked older than I remembered. More gray hair. more lines around his eyes. But his handshake remained firm. Margaret. Richard. He studied my face for a moment. You sounded concerned on the phone. I followed him into his office. Bookshelves lined the walls. Family photos sat neatly on a side table. The familiar surroundings made me feel slightly calmer. Richard closed the door and took a seat. What can I do for you? For a moment I wasn't sure where to begin. The story sounded unbelievable even to me. But I told him everything. The birthday toast. The missing property folder. The brochure. The property records inquiry. Melissa watching my house. Richard listened without interrupting. When I finally finished, he leaned back in his chair. His expression had changed. The relaxed smile was gone. Have you signed anything recently? The question surprised me. No. Any financial documents? No. Power of attorney forms? No. He nodded slowly, then opened a file cabinet beside his desk. Several minutes passed while he searched through folders. Eventually he returned carrying a thick file. Harold's estate file. Seeing my husband's name on the cover sent an unexpected ache through my chest. Richard placed the file on his desk. Margaret, there's something I need to ask. His tone was different now. Careful. Measured. My pulse quickened. What is it? Have Daniel or Melissa ever discussed changing your living arrangements? I immediately thought of Lily's question. When are you moving? Not directly. Richard nodded. Then he removed several documents from the file. 3 months ago, someone contacted my office requesting information. The room suddenly felt smaller. What kind of information? Questions regarding the administration of Harold's estate. I stared at him. Who asked? Richard hesitated. Melissa. The answer hit harder than I expected. Not because I was surprised, because hearing it confirmed everything. I looked down at my hands. Suddenly they seemed much older, much more fragile. What exactly did she want? Information about property ownership. I closed my eyes briefly. The house. Of course. Everything kept leading back to the house. Richard continued. I refuse to discuss private estate matters without your authorization. A small sense of relief washed through me. At least someone had protected my interests. Did she explain why she wanted the information? His expression darkened. She claimed she was helping you prepare for future care arrangements. Future care arrangements. The same phrase. Different words. Same meaning. Nursing home. Assisted living. Moving. Removing me from my own home. Every road led back to the same destination. I looked out the office window. Traffic moved slowly below. People walked along sidewalks. Ordinary lives continuing as normal. Meanwhile, my own family appeared to be planning mine without me. Richard remained silent for a moment. Then he asked a question I hadn't expected. Margaret, how well do you understand Harold's estate plan? I frowned. Reasonably well. Not completely. No. Harold handled most of the legal details during his final years. I trusted him. And he trusted Richard. That had always been enough. Richard slowly closed the file. Then he folded his hands together. There may be some things you don't know. A chill moved through me. What things? He glanced toward the closed office door. Then back at me. For the first time since the meeting began, I saw genuine concern in his eyes. Before Harold died, he added several protective provisions to his estate plan. I stared at him. Protective provisions. The words meant nothing. Yet somehow they felt important. Very important. Why? Richard took a long breath. Because he was worried. Worried about what? The silence lasted several seconds. Then Richard finally answered. He was worried someone might try to separate you from your home. I felt my heart stop. For a moment I couldn't speak. Couldn't move. Couldn't think. Because Harold had seen this possibility years ago. Long before I had. Long before the birthday toast. Long before the missing documents. Long before Melissa began circling my life like a predator. And suddenly I realized something terrifying. If Harold had taken steps to protect me, then perhaps he had already seen something in Melissa that the rest of us had missed. Something dangerous. Something I was only beginning to understand. For several moments neither of us spoke. I sat across from Richard Benson's desk trying to process what I had just heard. Harold had been worried. Not generally worried. Not the ordinary concerns every husband has about leaving his wife behind. Specifically worried that someone might try to separate me from my home. The realization unsettled me more than anything Melissa had done so far. Because Harold wasn't a suspicious man. He never jumped to conclusions. He never accused people without reason. If he had taken legal steps to protect me, then something must have happened. Something serious enough to leave an impression. Richard seemed to sense my thoughts. He folded his hands carefully on top of the estate file. Margaret, I don't want you to misunderstand. I looked up. Misunderstand what? Harold never accused anyone directly. That sounded exactly like Harold. Even near the end of his life, he always tried to see the best in people. Especially family. But he noticed things, Richard continued. What kind of things? Richard opened the file again. Several documents were arranged neatly inside. Notes, letters, legal amendments, years of careful planning. There were conversations. Questions about the property. Immediately I thought of Melissa. But Richard shook his head. Not just Melissa. The answer surprised me. My stomach tightened. What do you mean? Richard hesitated, then spoke carefully. There were occasions when Daniel asked questions as well. For a moment the room seemed quieter. I stared at him. My son. The little boy who once cried when he scraped his knee. The teenager who spent weekends helping Harold repair the deck. The young man who promised he would always look after me. Daniel. What kind of questions? Richard sighed. Mostly about future ownership. I looked away. The words hurt more than I expected. Not because discussing inheritance is unusual. Families do it all the time. But because of the timing. Harold had still been alive. Still fighting cancer. Still trying to stay with us. And they were already asking questions about ownership. About the future. About what would happen when he was gone. Richard seemed reluctant to continue. But I needed the truth. Tell me everything. He nodded slowly. There were discussions about whether maintaining the house would become difficult for you. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was absurd. Harold and I had lived there for nearly 48 years. I knew every room. Every creak in the floorboards. Every light switch. Every cabinet hinge. The house wasn't difficult. It was home. They suggested downsizing might eventually be necessary. The phrase sounded familiar. Too familiar. Future care arrangements. Moving. Downsizing. Assisted living. Different words. Same destination. Richard continued. Harold wasn't comfortable with the direction of those conversations. I leaned back slowly. For the first time, pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together. Not perfectly, but enough. This hadn't started after Harold died. It hadn't started after my birthday. It hadn't even started recently. The idea had existed for years. Quietly. Patiently. Growing beneath the surface. Like roots spreading underground. I thought back to the final year of Harold's illness. Melissa visited often. At least she appeared to. At the time I thought she was being supportive. Helpful. Thoughtful. Now old memories looked different. I remembered overhearing a conversation in the kitchen one afternoon. Melissa asking whether the upstairs bedrooms were still being used. Whether the property taxes were increasing. Whether Harold had considered simplifying things. At the time the questions seemed harmless. Now they felt calculated. Deliberate. Richard reached into the file again. This time he removed a sealed envelope. My breath caught. I recognized Harold's handwriting immediately. After 48 years of marriage, some things become impossible to forget. My fingers trembled slightly. What's this? Richard slid the envelope across the desk. Harold left instructions regarding this. I stared at it. My husband's name was written across the front. Nothing else. Just Harold's familiar handwriting. For a moment, I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Seeing those letters felt like hearing his voice again. Finally I picked it up. The paper felt fragile. Older than I expected. When was this written? About 8 months before he passed away. I swallowed hard. 8 months. Around the time his treatments had become more aggressive. Around the time he started preparing for possibilities neither of us wanted to discuss. What does it say? Richard shook his head gently. I never read it. That answer surprised me. It was sealed when Harold delivered it. I stared at the envelope. A message from my husband. Waiting all these years. Waiting until now. Part of me wanted to open it immediately. Another part was afraid. Afraid of what I might find. Afraid of how much Harold already knew. Eventually, I slipped the envelope into my purse. I would read it at home. Alone. The way Harold would have wanted. As our meeting came to an end, Richard walked me toward the door. Before I left, he stopped. Margaret. I turned back. There is one more thing. The seriousness in his voice made my pulse quicken. What is it? Richard looked directly at me. If anyone asks you to sign documents regarding the property. He paused. Don't. A chill moved through me. Has someone tried? I can't discuss everything. That answer told me enough. Someone had tried. Or was planning to. Richard's expression remained calm, professional, but there was concern behind it. Real concern. The kind that cannot be hidden. I thanked him and left. The drive home passed in silence. The sealed envelope rested on the passenger seat beside me. I glanced at it several times during the drive. Each time memories returned. Harold laughing in the backyard. Harold teaching Ethan how to fish. Harold holding my hand during long walks after dinner. The idea that he had prepared something specifically for this situation made my chest ache. By the time I reached home, the sun was beginning to set. Golden light stretched across the front lawn. Everything looked peaceful. Normal. Yet I knew better now. The danger wasn't outside. It was much closer. It wore familiar faces. Used familiar voices. Shared my last name. I carried the envelope inside and locked the front door behind me. Then I sat at the kitchen table where Harold and I had shared thousands of meals together. The house felt completely silent. Only the ticking clock broke the stillness. My fingers rested on the edge of the envelope. 4 years, Harold's final message had remained unopened. Hidden. Waiting. And somehow I knew that once I read those words, everything was going to change. I sat alone at the kitchen table for nearly 10 minutes before opening the envelope. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. Outside, evening shadows stretched across the backyard. Everything felt strangely still. As though the entire house was holding its breath. The envelope rested in front of me. Harold's handwriting stared back. Simple. Familiar. Comforting. And somehow heartbreaking. Finally, I slid a finger beneath the seal. The paper crackled softly as I opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter. Several pages long. The moment I saw Harold's writing, my vision blurred. Not from age. From memory. I took a deep breath and began reading. My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, then something has happened that worried me more than I ever admitted. I stopped. My hands tightened around the paper. Even now, years later, Harold sounded exactly like himself. Calm. Thoughtful. Careful with every word. I continued. I hope this letter is never needed. I hope I was wrong. But if you are reading this, then trust your instincts. They have always been stronger than mine. A chill moved through me. Trust your instincts. Those were exactly the words I had been fighting against for weeks. The letter continued. Harold wrote about our life together. About our first apartment. About raising Daniel. About family vacations. Simple memories. The kind that seem ordinary until they're gone. Then the tone changed. More serious. More direct. There were moments during my illness when I became concerned about conversations happening around me. I read the sentence twice. Then a third time. Concerned conversations. My pulse quickened. Harold explained that during his treatments, people sometimes forgot he was still listening. They assumed medication made him unaware. That fatigue made him inattentive. They were wrong. He heard more than they realized. One afternoon, while resting in the living room, he overheard a discussion between Daniel and Melissa. Nothing dramatic. Nothing openly cruel. Just a conversation about the future. About the house. About assets. About what would happen after he was gone. My stomach tightened. The letter continued. Perhaps they meant no harm. Perhaps they were only planning ahead. But I saw something in Melissa's attitude that troubled me. I wasn't surprised. Not anymore. The surprise came with the next sentence. Unfortunately, Daniel seemed increasingly willing to follow her lead. I lowered the paper. For a moment, I simply stared at the kitchen wall. The words hurt. Not because they came from Harold. Because deep down I already knew they were true. Daniel had changed over the years. Slowly. Gradually. Almost invisibly. The son who once defended me against playground bullies had become a man who couldn't defend me from a birthday toast. Harold had noticed long before I did. I continued reading. The next pages explained why Richard had mentioned protective provisions. Harold had quietly changed portions of his estate plan. Not to punish anyone. Not to control anyone. To protect me. Specifically me. One paragraph stood out above all the others. If anyone attempts to pressure you into leaving your home, remember this house remains yours entirely. No one can force a decision without your consent. I read those words 3 times. Relief washed over me. For weeks I had been wondering whether I was vulnerable, whether paperwork existed that I didn't understand, whether someone had already positioned themselves to take control. Now I knew the truth. Legally, the house was secure. Harold had made certain of it. But then I reached the final pages. And that's where everything became clear. Harold described several incidents from his final year. Questions from Melissa. Repeated questions. Questions about property values. Questions about long-term care. Questions about transferring ownership. Questions that appeared harmless individually, but together formed a pattern. The exact same pattern I was seeing now. Only one difference existed. Harold saw it years earlier. At the bottom of the final page, one sentence stood alone, written separately from everything else, almost like a warning. If Melissa ever begins discussing nursing homes, assisted living, or selling the property, do not ignore it. I felt the blood drain from my face. Nursing homes. The exact words. The exact subject. The exact concern. Years before my 70th birthday. Years before the toast. Years before the brochure. Harold had predicted it. Not perfectly, but close enough. Close enough to leave a warning. I carefully folded the letter and sat in silence. The room seemed different now. Brighter somehow. Not because the situation had improved. Because uncertainty was gone. For weeks I had been searching for answers. Now I finally had them. Melissa wasn't improvising. She wasn't making casual remarks. She wasn't joking. This had been building for years. The realization should have made me angry. Oddly, it didn't. Instead, I felt calm. Very calm. Because uncertainty creates fear. Truth creates clarity. And clarity is powerful. The next morning, my phone rang just after 9. Melissa. I stared at her name on the screen. Then answered. Good morning, Margaret. Her voice sounded unusually cheerful. Almost excited. Good morning. We wanted to stop by this weekend. We. Not Daniel. We. Small detail. An important one. What for? There was a brief pause. Then she laughed lightly. Oh, nothing serious. Just family matters. Family matters. The phrase instantly raised every alarm inside me. What kind of family matters? Another pause. Longer this time. Then she said the words I had been expecting. Daniel and I have been discussing some options that might make life easier for you. There it was. The beginning. The first open move. Not a joke. Not a hint. A move. I looked across the kitchen toward Harold's empty chair. For years he had protected me. Even after death he was still doing it. I smiled softly. Not because I was happy. Because I finally understood the game being played. And for the first time I knew something Melissa didn't. She thought she was preparing me. What she didn't realize was that I was already prepared. Much better prepared than she could possibly imagine. So I kept my voice calm. Pleasant. Completely harmless. That sounds lovely, I said. Come by on Sunday. After hanging up, I opened my notebook and wrote down the date. Then I added one final sentence beneath everything else. Sunday. They are finally making their move. And this time I'll be ready. The days leading up to Sunday passed surprisingly quietly. Too quietly. That alone told me something. People planning something rarely become louder. They become more careful, more patient, more confident. Melissa had spent years working toward whatever future she imagined for herself. Now she believed she was close, and confident people make mistakes. So I decided to give her exactly what she wanted. A harmless old woman, an unsuspecting widow, someone too lonely to ask questions, too fragile to resist, too trusting to notice. By Thursday afternoon, Melissa called again. Her voice sounded warmer than usual, friendlier, almost affectionate. "How are you feeling, Margaret?" The question seemed innocent, but something about it felt rehearsed. "I'm doing well." "That's wonderful." A pause followed. Then she added casually, "Daniel and I have been talking about how much we worry about you living alone." There it was again. The setup, the concern, the carefully packaged kindness. I smiled even though she couldn't see it. "That's sweet of you. We just want what's best for you." People often reveal their intentions through familiar phrases. "What's best for you? You don't need to worry anymore. We're only trying to help." Sometimes those words are sincere. Sometimes they are not. After hanging up, I opened my notebook. Every conversation now followed the same pattern. Concern, housing, safety, future plans, different wording, same destination. Sunday morning arrived bright and warm, the kind of spring day Harold loved. Sunlight filled the kitchen. Birds gathered near the backyard feeder. Everything looked peaceful. I spent the morning baking an apple pie. Not because I felt like baking, because routine helps maintain appearances. And appearances mattered now. At exactly 2 o'clock, Daniel and Melissa arrived. I watched through the front window as they walked up the driveway. Daniel looked uncomfortable. Melissa looked determined. The contrast immediately caught my attention. One appeared nervous. The other appeared prepared. I opened the door before they could knock. "Come in." Melissa hugged me. Daniel offered a brief smile. We sat in the living room. The same living room where Harold had spent his final months. The same room where family holidays had once filled every corner with laughter. For several minutes we talked about ordinary things. The grandchildren, the weather, school activities. Nobody mentioned the real reason they were there. Not yet. Finally, Melissa set down her coffee cup. The moment had arrived. "Margaret." Her voice softened. "We've been worried." I nodded politely. "Worried about what?" She exchanged a glance with Daniel. The same glance I had seen dozens of times recently. Then she continued. "Living alone can become difficult." There it was. Direct at last. I kept my expression calm. "I manage quite well." "Of course you do." Melissa smiled. "But things change." I said nothing. Silence can be surprisingly useful. People often rush to fill it. Melissa certainly did. "We've been exploring some wonderful options." Options. Not choices. Options. The language fascinated me. The decision had already been made in her mind. Now she was simply introducing it. Daniel finally spoke. His voice sounded uncertain. "There are some really nice communities nearby." Communities. Not nursing homes. Another carefully chosen word. I almost admired the strategy. Almost. Melissa pulled a folder from her handbag. A folder. Prepared in advance. Just as I expected. She placed it on the coffee table. Inside were photographs, brochures, floor plans, price sheets. Everything neatly organized. Months of planning condensed into a single folder. I recognized one brochure immediately. The same facility from the anonymous envelope. The same smiling seniors. The same fountain. The same place. I felt a strange sense of calm. For weeks I had wondered. Now I knew. Beyond any doubt. They had already chosen a destination. Perhaps they had even chosen a room. Melissa opened the folder. "This one is beautiful." She pointed at a photograph. "Private suites." Another page. "Excellent medical support." Another page. "Activities every day." She spoke enthusiastically, like a real estate agent presenting a dream home. Meanwhile, Daniel remained mostly silent, watching, listening, avoiding eye contact. That hurt more than Melissa's presentation, because silence requires participation. He wasn't leading the conversation. But he wasn't stopping it either. I looked at the brochures carefully, then smiled. Melissa seemed encouraged. Perhaps she mistook my calmness for agreement. "What do you think?" she asked. I turned another page. "It looks lovely." The answer surprised both of them. I could see it immediately. Melissa blinked. Daniel looked up. Neither had expected cooperation. They expected resistance, arguments, tears, questions. Instead, I gave them none. Melissa recovered first. "I knew you'd understand." I nodded slowly. At my age, it's important to keep an open mind. The relief on her face was impossible to miss. For the next 30 minutes, she talked almost nonstop. Amenities, services, transportation, meal plans, future arrangements. The more comfortable she became, the more information she revealed. And I listened carefully. Every detail mattered. Every assumption mattered. By the time they left, I knew. More than ever before. Not only had they researched facilities, they had already met with administrators, visited locations, compared pricing, discussed timelines. This wasn't an idea. It was a plan. A nearly completed plan. After they drove away, I remained standing near the front window, watching the empty street, thinking. Melissa believed the meeting had gone perfectly. She believed I was beginning to accept the future she had chosen for me. She believed the hardest part was over. She was wrong. Because while she spent Sunday celebrating progress, I spent Sunday preparing. That evening I called Richard Benson. When he answered, I spoke only one sentence. "They finally showed me the brochures." A long silence followed. Then Richard quietly replied. "Good." I frowned. "Good." "Yes, Margaret." His voice remained calm. "Because now they've shown their hand." I looked toward Harold's letter resting on the kitchen counter. For the first time, I realized something important. The game was changing. And very soon, someone was going to discover that Harold had prepared far more than a simple warning letter. Much more. The week after our meeting passed exactly as I expected. Melissa became more relaxed, more confident, more talkative. People often reveal the most when they think they've already won. And Melissa clearly believed she had. On Tuesday, she sent me several links to retirement communities. On Wednesday, she called to tell me about an open house event at one of the facilities. By Friday, she was discussing waiting lists and move-in dates as if decisions had already been made. I responded the same way every time. Politely, calmly, without resistance. Each response seemed to encourage her. Meanwhile, I continued documenting everything. Every call, every text, every brochure, every conversation. Richard advised me to keep detailed records. So I did. One evening, while reviewing my notes, I realized something interesting. Neither Melissa nor Daniel had ever directly asked what I wanted. Not once. They spoke constantly about convenience, safety, comfort, future planning. But never my wishes. Never my choice. Never my voice. The realization saddened me more than I expected. Because beneath all the brochures and polite conversations was a simple truth. They weren't planning with me. They were planning around me. Saturday afternoon, Daniel called unexpectedly. His voice sounded nervous. More nervous than usual. "Mom. Sweetheart. Melissa and I wanted to ask you something." I waited. There was a brief silence. Then he continued. "Would you be willing to meet with someone next week?" My pulse quickened. Someone. A consultant. Consultant. Another carefully chosen word. I almost smiled. The language kept changing. The destination never did. What kind of consultant? This time Melissa's voice appeared in the background. I couldn't hear her words. Only her prompting. Daniel cleared his throat. A senior transition specialist. There it was. Not hidden anymore. Not disguised. Almost official. Almost final. I allowed a few seconds to pass before answering. "If you think it would help." The silence on the other end was immediate. They hadn't expected agreement. Again. Finally Daniel spoke. "Really?" "Of course." His relief was obvious. "That's great, Mom." The call ended a few minutes later. As soon as I hung up, I opened my notebook. Another step forward. Another piece of evidence. Another sign that they believed I was cooperating. On Monday morning, Richard called. His timing was almost perfect. "How are things progressing?" I looked at the growing stack of brochures on my kitchen counter. "Exactly as you predicted." He laughed softly. "That's usually how these situations work." I sat down at the table. "Daniel wants me to meet a consultant." The line went quiet. Then Richard spoke carefully. "Good." I smiled. "You keep saying that." "Because every step they take creates a clearer record." I understood what he meant. The more confident Melissa became, the more visible her plan became. And visible plans are easier to challenge. Before ending the call, Richard shared one final piece of information. "There will likely be a meeting soon." I frowned. "What kind of meeting?" "The kind where they expect you to agree." A chill moved through me, as deep down I knew he was right. Everything had been building toward something. The brochures, the conversations, the consultant. None of those were the goal. They were preparation. The real objective still lay ahead. Thursday evening provided confirmation. Melissa called just after dinner. Her tone sounded unusually cheerful. Excited even. "Margaret, I have wonderful news." Wonderful news. People often describe things as wonderful when they are wonderful for themselves, not necessarily for anyone else. "What is it?" "We've arranged a meeting next Saturday." There it was. The meeting. I remained silent. Melissa eagerly continued. "Everyone will be there." Everyone. Interesting. Not just Daniel. Not just Melissa. Everyone. Family pressure works best when performed in groups. "What exactly is the meeting about?" Another brief pause. Then Melissa answered. "We want to discuss the next chapter of your life." The phrase was almost impressive. Carefully prepared. Emotionally polished. Completely dishonest. Because they weren't discussing my next chapter. They were writing it. Without my permission. Still, I kept my voice warm. "That sounds important." "It is." I could practically hear her smiling. "We've worked very hard on this." Worked very hard. That single sentence told me everything. Not considered. Not discussed. Worked on. Planned. Organized. Executed. For months. Maybe years. The meeting was already decided in her mind. Saturday would simply be the announcement. Not the conversation. After hanging up, I walked into the living room. The evening sun cast long shadows across the hardwood floor. I stopped in front of a photograph of Harold. It had been taken during a fishing trip many years ago. He looked relaxed. Happy. Certain. For a moment I imagined what he would say. Probably something simple. Something practical. Harold always believed preparation beats panic. And for the first time I realized I wasn't nervous anymore. A few weeks earlier I had been confused. Then suspicious. Then hurt. Now I was prepared. I knew their plan. I knew their assumptions. And thanks to Harold I knew things they didn't. Saturday morning arrived faster than expected. I dressed carefully. A navy blue blouse. Pearl earrings. The same silver bracelet Harold gave me on our 40th anniversary. Nothing dramatic. Nothing unusual. Just myself. Around 11 o'clock, Daniel arrived to drive me to the meeting. As I stepped outside I noticed his expression. He looked tense. Almost guilty. Melissa sat in the passenger seat. Confident as ever. When she saw me she smiled brightly. The smile of someone expecting success. The smile of someone already celebrating victory. I returned the smile. Then climbed into the back seat. As we drove away, neither of them noticed what I had placed inside my handbag that morning. Harold's letter. My notebook. And several documents Richard had recently prepared. Because while Melissa believed today's meeting would finalize my future, today's meeting was about to change hers. The drive across town lasted less than 20 minutes. No one spoke much. Melissa spent most of the trip checking her phone. Daniel focused on the road. I sat quietly in the back seat watching familiar neighborhoods pass by outside the window. The closer we got to our destination, the calmer I became. A few weeks earlier I would have been nervous. Now I wasn't. Because uncertainty was gone. I finally understood what they were trying to do. And more importantly, I knew something they didn't. Richard knew too. When Daniel pulled into the parking lot, I immediately recognized the building. Modern, professional, 3 stories of glass and steel. The kind of place designed to make important decisions feel inevitable. Melissa smiled as she stepped out of the car. There it is. The excitement in her voice was difficult to hide. Inside, a receptionist greeted us warmly. She already knew our names. Another sign that today's meeting had been arranged long ago. Not recently. Not casually. Carefully. A young assistant escorted us into a conference room. A woman in her 50s sat near the far end of the table. Beside her was a younger man with a tablet. Both introduced themselves as senior transition specialists. Experts. Advisors. Profissionals. People whose job was helping older adults relocate. Nothing inappropriate about that. Nothing unusual. At least on the surface. Coffee was offered. Folders were distributed. Polite introductions were exchanged. The atmosphere felt pleasant. Almost cheerful. Melissa seemed especially relaxed. She sat beside me wearing the confident smile of someone who believed everything was proceeding according to plan. The meeting began. The consultant thanked everyone for attending. Then she launched into a presentation. For the next 20 minutes, photographs appeared on a large screen. Beautiful retirement communities, private suites, gardens, libraries, walking paths, activity centers, dining rooms. Everything looked comfortable, safe, welcoming. I listened carefully. The facilities themselves weren't the problem. Many older Americans choose communities like those. Many thrive there. That was never the issue. The issue was choice. Nobody had asked what I wanted. They had only explained what they wanted for me. The consultant continued speaking. Safety, convenience, reduced responsibilities, lower stress. The language remained positive, professional, well-practiced. Then the presentation shifted, and the real purpose finally appeared. A photograph of my house filled the screen. The room grew noticeably quieter. The consultant smiled politely. One potential advantage involves the value currently tied to the property. There it was. The house. Everything always returned to the house. Property values, market conditions, financial flexibility, long-term planning. The presentation wasn't really about where I would live. It was about what could be done with what I owned. Melissa leaned slightly toward me. Doesn't this make sense? I turned toward her, then looked back at the screen. It explains quite a lot. She smiled, clearly pleased with my answer. She misunderstood it completely. The consultant moved to the final stage of the presentation. A folder was placed in front of me. Several forms. Assessment paperwork.
Consultation agrément.
Authorization documents. Nothing immediately dangerous. Nothing requiring immediate action. But enough to start a process. Enough to create momentum. Enough to make future decisions easier. The consultant folded her hands. Mrs. Turner, these documents simply allow us to begin exploring options. Simply. People often use that word when something is far from simple. I slowly opened the folder, pretending to study the pages. In reality, I was checking the time. 11:58. Right on schedule. 2 minutes later, the conference room door opened. This time nobody looked surprised. Because unlike the original version of this story, Richard wasn't arriving unexpectedly. He had been invited by me days earlier. After our last phone conversation, I had told him about the meeting, and he suggested attending, just in case. Richard stepped into the room carrying a leather briefcase. The consultant immediately stood. Mr. Benson. They clearly knew who he was. That interested me. Richard smiled politely. Thank you for allowing me to join you. Melissa's expression changed. Only slightly, but enough. For the first time all morning, uncertainty appeared on her face. Richard took a seat beside me. Calm, professional, unhurried. Exactly the way Harold always described him. The consultant looked toward me. Mrs. Turner, would you like your attorney present during today's discussion? Attorney. The word landed heavily, especially on Melissa. I smiled. Yes. Richard placed his briefcase on the table, then opened it. Inside sat a thick collection of documents. Harold's estate file. The same file that had changed everything for me days earlier. Melissa immediately noticed it. So did Daniel. The confidence that had carried her through the presentation began to fade. The consultant exchanged a glance with her colleague. Something had shifted. Everyone could feel it. Richard removed several documents and placed them neatly on the table. Then he looked directly at the consultant. Before any paperwork is signed, there are several legal matters that should be clarified. The room fell silent. The consultant nodded. Of course. No resistance.
No argument.
Just professionalism. Richard turned toward me, then toward Daniel and Melissa. Finally, he rested one document at the top of the stack. A document bearing Harold's signature. The room seemed to grow smaller, quieter. He folded his hands calmly, then spoke. Before we discuss where Margaret should live, he paused. Everyone here needs to understand exactly what Harold intended. And suddenly nobody seemed interested in the presentation anymore. No one spoke immediately. The conference room felt different now. A few minutes earlier, everyone had been discussing retirement communities, transition plans, and future options. Now every eye was fixed on the documents resting in front of Richard Benson. The presentation screen still displayed a photograph of my house, but nobody was looking at it anymore. The consultant quietly sat back in her chair. Her colleague closed his tablet. The room had shifted, and everyone knew it. Richard adjusted his glasses, then opened the estate file. His movements were calm, deliberate, unhurried, the same way Harold used to approach difficult conversations. Before any future planning takes place, Richard said, it's important that everyone understands the legal structure Harold created before his death. Nobody interrupted. Melissa folded her arms. Daniel remained silent. I simply listened. Richard removed the first document, then distributed copies around the table. The consultant accepted hers politely. Daniel accepted his. Melissa hesitated before taking hers. I noticed that. People often hesitate when they fear what comes next. Richard waited until everyone finished reading. Then he spoke. Approximately 8 months before his passing, Harold amended several portions of his estate plan. The room remained silent. The purpose was simple. Richard paused. To ensure Margaret could never be pressured into leaving her home. I watched Melissa's eyes move down the page. Slowly, carefully. Her confidence was beginning to disappear. Richard continued. The property cannot be sold, transferred, leveraged, or managed without Margaret's direct written authorization. The consultant nodded slightly. Professional. Objective. Simply acknowledging the facts. For the first time that afternoon, the house no longer looked like an opportunity. It looked exactly what it was. Mine. Richard opened another section of the file. There is also a written statement from Harold. That immediately caught Daniel's attention. His head lifted. For a moment he looked less like a husband and more like a son. Richard unfolded several pages, then began reading. Harold's words filled the room. Not accusations, not anger, observations, concerns, warnings. He described repeated discussions regarding property values, questions about ownership, suggestions about future housing arrangements. The language remained careful, respectful, exactly the way Harold always spoke. Yet somehow that made it more powerful. Because nobody could dismiss it as emotion. These were simply facts, observed by a man who paid attention. As Richard continued reading, I watched Daniel. His expression changed with every paragraph. Confusion, discomfort, recognition, then disappointment. A deep disappointment that seemed directed mostly at himself. The room fell silent again when Richard finished. Nobody moved. Nobody seemed eager to speak first. Finally, the consultant broke the silence. Mrs. Turner, based on what we've learned today, I believe any future housing decision should remain entirely yours. I appreciated her professionalism.
No defensiveness. No embarrassment.
Just honesty. Richard nodded. I agree. Then he closed the file. For a moment, I thought the meeting was over. Then Daniel spoke. His voice sounded different. Quieter. Stronger. When did this start? Nobody answered. Daniel looked directly at Melissa. I'm asking you. Melissa shifted slightly in her chair. What do you mean? The nursing homes. His voice remained calm. The research. The meetings. The brochures. When did this start? Melissa looked away. The silence stretched. Long enough for everyone to notice. Finally she sighed. Daniel. When? For the first time there was firmness in his voice. Not anger. Not hostility. Just a refusal to look away. Melissa stared at the table. Then toward the window. Anywhere except at him. That's not important. Daniel shook his head. Yes, it is. Another silence. Longer this time. The consultant quietly lowered her eyes. Even she understood what was happening. Eventually Melissa spoke. Barely above a whisper. About 2 years ago. Nobody reacted immediately. The number simply settled into the room. 2 years. Long before my birthday. Long before the brochures appeared. Long before anyone claimed they were simply worried about me. 2 years. Daniel stared at her. You've been planning this for 2 years? Melissa's shoulders tightened. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like? She looked frustrated now. Cornered. For the first time since I had known her, she seemed unable to control the conversation. We were thinking ahead. We? Daniel asked quietly. Melissa hesitated. The hesitation answered the question. Daniel looked down at the documents in front of him. Then toward the photograph of my house still displayed on the screen. Something finally connected. I could see it happen. The realization. The pattern. The truth. All at once. You thought Mom would eventually agree. Melissa said nothing. You thought if enough people recommended it. Still nothing. She would leave. The silence became an answer. No explanation could have been more convincing. Nobody needed one. The room already understood. Including Melissa. For several moments nobody spoke. Then she finally looked toward me. Not Daniel. Not Richard. Me. And for the first time there was no confidence left. No carefully rehearsed concern.
No polished presentation.
Only regret. Or perhaps embarrassment. Maybe both. Margaret, she said softly. This isn't how I wanted this to happen. I looked at her calmly. After everything that had happened, I found I wasn't angry. Not anymore. Anger requires energy. And clarity had replaced anger days ago. I simply nodded. Maybe. Nothing more. Nothing less. Because the truth no longer needed my help. It was already sitting on the table in front of everyone. And for the first time since my 70th birthday, nobody was laughing. Nobody was laughing. The silence inside the conference room seemed to stretch forever. Not because anyone was angry, because everyone was thinking. Sometimes the truth arrives with shouting. Sometimes it arrives with silence. This was the second kind. The consultant quietly gathered her notes. Her colleague closed his tablet. Neither attempted to continue the presentation. There was no point. The meeting that Melissa had spent months preparing no longer existed. Something more important had taken its place. Reality. Richard calmly organized Harold's documents and placed them back inside his briefcase. Then he looked at me. Margaret, unless you have questions, I believe we're finished here. I smiled. No questions. And for the first time in weeks that was true. I had spent so much time searching for answers. Now I finally had them. Not all answers bring happiness. Some simply bring clarity. And clarity is enough. One by one people stood. The consultants thanked everyone politely and left the room. Professional to the very end. Soon only 4 of us remained. Richard, Daniel, Melissa, and me. Nobody seemed eager to speak first. Finally Richard stood. Before leaving, he placed a hand gently on my shoulder. Harold used to do the same thing. The gesture almost made me smile. Take care of yourself, he said. I will. He nodded once. Then left. The door closed quietly behind him. Now only family remained. Or what was left of it. Daniel sat motionless for several seconds. His eyes remained fixed on the table. On Harold's documents. On the truth he had spent years avoiding. When he finally looked up, he wasn't looking at Melissa. He was looking at me. And for the first time since my 70th birthday, He didn't look away. Mom! His voice cracked slightly. Just once. But it was enough. I saw the little boy he used to be. The little boy who followed me through grocery stores. The little boy who held my hand crossing parking lots. The little boy who once promised he would always protect me. Not because he had returned. Because he had finally remembered who he was.
I'm sorry.
Simple words. Nothing dramatic. Nothing rehearsed. Just honest. I believed him. That didn't erase what happened. But I believed him. For several moments neither of us spoke. Then Daniel lowered his head. I should have stopped it. I nodded. Yes. The answer wasn't cruel. It was true. And sometimes truth matters more than comfort. A tear rolled down his cheek. He quickly wiped it away. But not before I saw it. Across the table, Melissa remained silent. Gone was the confident woman from the birthday party. Gone was the woman who raised a champagne glass and announced my future. Now she simply looked tired. Very tired. For the first time, I wondered if she fully understood what she had lost. Not the house. Not the plan. Trust. Trust takes years to build. Moments to break. And much longer to repair. Eventually she looked toward me. I'm sorry too. The words sounded genuine. But different. Not complete. Not yet. Some apologies arrive before understanding. Others arrive afterward. I wasn't sure which kind this was. So I simply nodded. Nothing more. Nothing less. Forgiveness is a journey. Not a sentence. A few minutes later we walked out together. The afternoon sun was bright. Almost surprisingly bright. As though the world had continued turning while our family sat inside that conference room. Daniel drove me home. Melissa sat quietly in the passenger seat. Nobody spoke much during the drive. There wasn't anything left to argue about. The truth had already done its work. When we pulled into my driveway, I looked at the house. My house. The same white shutters. The same front porch. The same maple tree Harold planted nearly 30 years earlier. Nothing had changed. And yet everything had. Daniel turned off the engine. For a moment nobody moved. Then he spoke. Can we start over? I looked at him. Not as a disappointed mother. Not as a victim. Simply as a woman who had lived long enough to understand people. Start over. He nodded. If you'll let me. I smiled softly. We can't start over. The disappointment in his face appeared immediately. Then I continued. But we can move forward. Something relaxed inside him. A burden. Fear. Maybe both. When I stepped out of the car, he followed. Then he wrapped his arms around me. A real hug. The first real hug in a very long time. I hugged him back. Because despite everything, he was still my son. People make mistakes. Sometimes terrible mistakes. The important thing is whether they learn from them. I hoped he would. Over the next few months, life became quieter. The brochures disappeared. The conversations stopped. No one mentioned nursing homes. No one mentioned moving. No one mentioned selling the house. Melissa remained distant for a while. Then, gradually she began reaching out. A phone call. A holiday card. An invitation. Small things. Trust rebuilding itself one careful step at a time. Not perfectly, but honestly. One Saturday morning several months later, I sat alone on my back porch. A cup of coffee rested beside me. Birds moved through the garden. The roses were blooming again. Harold always loved spring. I picked up the framed photograph sitting on the small table beside my chair. His smile looked exactly the way I remembered it. Warm. Steady. Certain. For a long moment I simply stared at the picture. Then I laughed softly. You saw it before I did. The breeze moved through the trees. No answer came. None was needed. Because I already knew. Harold hadn't protected me because he expected the worst. He protected me because love prepares. Love notices.
Love paye attention.
Even when others don't. My eyes drifted toward the backyard. Toward the house. Toward the life we built together. And suddenly I remembered that birthday. The champagne glass. The laughter. The words. To the old lady headed for a nursing home. Back then the room laughed. I remember sitting there alone. Smiling while everyone else thought they already knew how my story would end. They were wrong. Not because I defeated anyone. Not because I won. Because my future remained mine. And at 70 years old, that was more valuable than any house. More valuable than any inheritance. More valuable than any plan someone else could make for me. Growing older does not mean surrendering your dignity. It does not mean giving away your voice. And it certainly does not mean allowing someone else to decide where your story ends. As the afternoon sun settled across the garden, I took another sip of coffee and smiled. I wasn't in a nursing home. I wasn't leaving. I wasn't forgotten. I was home, exactly where I belonged,